Welcome back. In this episode of Bohemian Sodbusters, we take a deep dive into my ancestors' tangled, interwoven families in Bukovina and follow them on their next migration across Europe, the Atlantic, and on to what they would have called Winnipeg in faraway Canada. Let's take a moment to situate Jadova and its sister village, Dobrova. Today, Bukovina lies within the borders of Ukraine, but historically it has been claimed by Turkey, Russia, Romania, and Austria, which acquired the province in 1775. After annexing it to Galicia, the empire began populating it with German-speaking settlers. Once again, these colonizers established language islands, surrounded by Ruthenians to the west and Romanians to the east. When my father's grandparents, Ferdinand Lang and Katharina Hartl, arrived in Jadova, Bukovina in 1897, they settled among other German-speaking families who had arrived years earlier, like the Hingers, Hartls, and Hofmeisters. Other Felicienthal and Karlsdorf families, Stefan and Margareta Rice, for example, followed in 1900. No doubt arranged in advance, Ferdinand acquired the local mill and settled into a house next door to Anton Hinger's complicated family. Tragedy shadowed Anton Hinger's first two marriages. Around 1870, he married Elizabeth Pilz, and they had two children, Joseph and Johanna. Sadly, Elizabeth died in 1882. Anton then married a Jewish woman named Marianna Rosenbaum, who died in 1888 while giving birth to twin girls. One died, and the other was Teresia, who weighed just 2 pounds. Incredibly, she survived. Anton was now a double widower with 3 children, and he needed another wife. Third time lucky, the newly arrived Rice family's eldest daughter Regina needed a husband. They married, and not only did Regina survive, she ultimately bore Anton 9 more children, for 12 in total. Regina had a younger sister, Agatha, who was giving her family conniptions. Before her parents migrated to Bukovina, her mother, Margareta, who had claimed to have noble ancestry, shipped Agatha off to a type of finishing school in Vienna, where it seems she dallied with fellow Felicienthaler, Ferdinand's nephew, Franz Lang, who was an army sergeant stationed at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna. The where and when remain fuzzy, but Agatha returned to Felicienthal pregnant and unwed. Shamed, Agatha and baby Wenzel lived with her sister Teresa in Felicienthal until 1902, when she was sent to Bukovina, where she served as a housemaid for her older sister Regina in the Anton Hinger home. All of Regina's children were Agatha's nieces and nephews, while Teresia, Joseph, and Johanna were her step-nieces and nephews. Over time, Teresia, nicknamed Rezel, would marry her former neighbor Maximilian Lang and bear my father, John. Thus, all the remaining Hinger children would become Dad's step-aunts and uncles. Agatha would eventually marry Franz and bear my mother, Anne. Franz and Maximilian Lang were first cousins, making my parents second cousins, which they were when they married. All of Regina's children were my mother's first cousins, and her mother-in-law Teresia was also her step-niece. It did not end there. Maximilian's brother Wilhelm, or Bill, would marry Anna Hinger, my father's step-aunt, who then became my father's regular aunt. There's more, but you've suffered enough. I've been doing genealogical work in this family for 20 years, and even I remain terminally befuddled. In future episodes, I'll tell the more detailed personal stories of my parents and grandparents. For now, it matters only that we understand the events set in motion when the Langs first met the Hingers of Bukovina. A few short years after their arrival in Jadova, the Langs, Hofmeisters, Hartls, and Hingers learned about offers of free land in a place called Canada, and they were ready to go. This was not the only factor in their decision to migrate. For years, tensions were rising among Austria's shaky member nations and regions, and our ancestors feared the existing mandatory conscription would put their sons in harm's way. Ferdinand's son, John, who had just returned from his 3-year tour, was hell-bent on heading to Canada. Although he had served in peacetime, as did his cousin Franz in Vienna, unrest was growing. Cossacks were conducting bloody rampages through Jewish villages, Muslims were massacred in the Balkans, and members of various royal families were being assassinated by anarchists determined to bring an end to Habsburg rule. As my father said in 1993,
because it's compulsory for anyone turning, 18 or I think at the age of 18, you had 3 years compulsory military service. Yeah. We should point out which is one of the main reasons that all these people left here, whether it is Moscow or Germany or anyone else, because we came to a country where there was no compulsory military service. So it's the history of why we're here.
By 1903, it was time to go, and 9 members of the Hinger family were among the first, along with Ferdinand's son John and his fiancée Elizabeth Ullmann, and Ferdinand's daughter Mariana and her husband Wenzel Hofmeister. Ferdinand and the rest of his family left the following year. It's important to remember who did not leave and what that meant. My great-grandparents, Stefan Reiss, Anton Hinger, and Michael Lang and his wife Mariana Hofmeister Lang, as well as most of their larger families, remained to endure the horrors of World War I, and the younger ones World War II. Both wars would position themselves and their new and old countries as enemies. We'll get into that part of our history in a later episode. After long days of travel by wagon and train, Ferdinand's party of 8 arrived in Hamburg, Germany, and joined the line to board the SS Arcadia as part of a total load of 1,136 passengers. Although most passengers on the SS Arcadia left with less than $10, Ferdinand had 800, a small fortune. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $250,000 today. Passengers were allowed as much luggage as they could carry, and based on my grandmother Agatha's trunk, she arrived a year later, these would have been heavy indeed. All were destined for steerage, below-decks accommodation that ranged from uncomfortable to horrific. Dozens of immigrant ships competed for passengers, driving the profit per passenger down to as low as $8. So while the ship provided a bunk or hammock, they provided food that the passengers had to cook themselves. Crossings could be perilous, with threats of North Atlantic storms and even icebergs along the way. In steerage, seasickness was epidemic, and during the 8 to 10 day voyage, the stench of garbage and human excrement was unbearable. Passage was to be endured, survived, and doubtless rarely enjoyed. The Arcadia arrived in Halifax on April the 15th, 1904 at 9 a.m. After processing, which involved medical examinations and, for the unlucky, days of quarantine, Ferdinand and his family boarded the Canadian Pacific Railroad's new low-budget colonist sleeper cars, bound for Winnipeg. In the next episode, life in Winnipeg, and then the final journey west to claim their free land.